Welcome to the Author Interviews for Liberty Matters, a bi-monthly forum of various authors and texts available on the Online Library of Liberty. The Online Library of Liberty is part of the Liberty Fund network of websites. For more information about Liberty Fund, visit our webpage at www.libertyfund.org. I'm Pat Lynch, a senior fellow at the Liberty Fund, and today I'm joined by Georgios Varouxakis, who has written one of the review essays for our August 2020 forum on J.S. Mill and life writing. If you'd like to watch our first interview with Ruth Skur, author of the lead essay, or any of our other interviews in this series, please visit our YouTube channel. A link to the forum itself is available on the Online Library of Liberty and is also available on our YouTube channel. Georgios is professor of the history of political thought at Queen Mary University of London. He completed his PhD at the University College London and began his academic career at Aston University, Birmingham. He moved to Queen Mary in 2006, and he is the co-director of the Queen Mary University London Center for the Study of the History of Political Thought, as well as the MA program in the History of Political Thought at Queen Mary. He's held various fellowships at universities throughout the world, including Princeton University, and he was a senior research fellow at the University of Göttingen. His research is focused on the thought of Mill and 19th and 20th century intellectual history generally, with a particular emphasis on cross-cultural exchanges, comparative and transnational history, and mutual perceptions. He's also focused on the political thought of nationalism and cosmopolitanism, empire, international political thought, and on the intellectual history of ideas of the empire, of the West, and Europe. Georgios, it is a great pleasure to have you with us today for this author interview for Liberty Matters. Welcome.
Thank you. The pleasure is all mine.
The pleasure is ours. It's really been a fun group of essays to host on the forum, and there's a lot of interesting things here. And with your essay in particular, there's a lot of meat to deal with. So I wanted to start with something that you mentioned right up in the first page of your essay, because you really have a really interesting observation about the nature of how Mill tries to deal with circumstance. At Liberty Fund, we're obviously very interested in the concept of liberty, but we're also very interested in the concept of personal responsibility. And what you tackle initially in this essay, and it's really interesting because it's not in the autobiography, it's in the system of logic, as you point out, this attempt for Mill to struggle with how individuals, and I'm not quite sure how to phrase it, you begin by talking about ethology and this idea about the science of the formation of character that he was interested in. And you say, according to Mill, if you cannot change the way circumstances affect you, you can try to change the circumstances to which you are exposed. This is a really interesting take on how individuals not only take responsibility for their actions, but might shape the way that they respond in responsible manners based on context and circumstance. Can you elaborate a little bit more on Mill's thought in this matter, either from the system of logic or from the autobiography or any of his other writings?
Yes, marvelous. It's everywhere. It's certainly stated as a theoretical statement in the system of logic, but it's also it's omnipresent in his works, in his remarks, in his letters, and so on. It's fundamental to him. It's very often a stereotype that English political thought is not sociological as opposed to the French, which is sociological, takes into account the social circumstances, and so on. This is grossly unfair in the case of Mill, I find, who spent all his life trying to combine French ways of thinking and French thought with English and Anglo-American ways of thinking. So exactly because he was sociologically conscious and sensitive, he knew that there are changing circumstances, there are changing social, economic, technological structures that affect how the environment in which people function. But Mill was obsessed with liberty. So Mill thought that you still cannot, you obviously operate within constraints, but you have to take responsibility, face the adversities, learn from them, pay the price sometimes, and through that build your own peculiar character and become a much more interesting person and much more interesting person to contemplate for others aesthetically as well, as he tells us in On Liberty. So in that context, what you remarked is very crucial to him. So he says, I do fully understand that circumstances affect people. That's exactly why he devised the whole science that which was clearly overambitious, of course, the science of ethology. again, the story is that he failed to come up with that science. That's a half-truth, because ethological considerations, what he would consider the axioms of that science, are everywhere in his works. The way he analyzes things, the way he explains things, the way he proposes things, and what should be done for them to be achieved are, of course, applications of what he had in mind in terms of the formation of character. So he was obsessed with that issue of the formation of character, both individual and collective, the character of a whole nation or people or collectivity. So in that context, he wanted people to be aware that there are things they can do, that no matter what the circumstances and how they affect you, you then may have to change the circumstances. And he's very clear that it's not always easy. It's not, you know, some people may have more chances to change their circumstances than not. But he did not want to succumb to, on the one hand, the Owenite understanding of some British so-called utopian socialists who would say criminals are not responsible, they are victims of society, people are the results of their circumstances and their upbringing, and there's nothing you can do. He was against that. And on the other hand, his big philosophical rival was the intuitionists in his time, who somehow would elevate their own prejudices, in his opinion, into intuitions about human nature. Mill wanted always to remind people, it is in your hands to a great extent. Obviously, not everything is in your hands, but quite a bit is in your hands, and you have to do your best. And I don't want to go on and on and on about this, because I would like to see which direction you would like to take it yourself. But that is why it was, I thought, very relevant to our theme, because he applied that to his own life. Yeah. Through the way he saw his life, through the way he explained his life to us, and through the selectiveness with which he thought he had to present it. Obviously, Ruth is absolutely right that no autobiography is the full story. He didn't want to give us the full story. He wanted to give us the parts of the story that he thought were relevant for his legacy or for people to improve themselves through reading it.
Well, and it's interesting because Jeremy Jennings, in his interview, talks a little bit about how he viewed the influence of his father in helping to change that context and build that character. But in Jeremy's view, his father plays a much less flattering role in terms of having that impact. It sounds to me like Mill, at least in your view, took that education as unusual as it was and tried to use it as a way to, as an example for people in which they could improve themselves or could tackle bigger challenges in life through an ongoing education or through a self-learning process. Is that a fair statement?
Wonderful question. Absolutely wonderful question. You mentioned Birmingham earlier and university, my earlier university. I know Jeremy since 1999 or something. So he's I think Jeremy is right, but an awful lot about the autobiography obviously is about the father. And I haven't seen his interview, of course, but I can suspect what he has in mind. What I would like to stress and try to stress in my second response is that the father was as harsh as people think. The father was as bad-tempered as Mill between the lines allows us to think. And somehow the autobiography is at one level a tribute to the father because he tried so hard and he gave him all these stimuli which Mill values, but also between the lines also, or somehow politely and with due filial piety, a description of the rebellion, of the rebellion against the father's education in order to take possession of his character and the narrative of his life. And that's why what we started with, which I'm extremely grateful you picked up on and focused on, the formation of character is so crucial to the narrative of the autobiography and to his whole philosophy and to his whole proposals for us. So the father was very important. Mill was very grateful because he basically, his father was right. There is an incident he describes in the autobiography that his father took him to Hyde Park, sat him on a bench and said, "You're going to go to France now for a few months and you'll meet other children without my supervision. Don't you think there's anything special about you when you realize you're something like 30 years ahead of them in what you know? It's all the accident of birth that you were my son and I educated you. Mill is very grateful for that. There's no doubt. He keeps saying it. At the same time, he says, if I had stuck to that and had not taken possession of my own education at some point by complementing what turned out to be not enough, hence the mental crisis he describes in a very moving and extremely powerful chapter, I would be a different person or I would have collapsed. So it is both a tribute to James Mill and a very polite criticism of James Mill's education. A point I tried to make in the very little space possible, of course, and I'm not complaining about the space because it's wonderful. The length is exactly brilliant. People can put their ideas and then have a discussion and respond. And I didn't know about the interview, but the interview is another wonderful idea to continue the conversation. So a thing I try to stress is, in a paradoxical way, perhaps, Mill tells us in that passage, which Ruth very felicitously stressed about the poetical nature of what he got from people's lives, from life narrative, from the lives of philosophers and the lives of Plutarch and so on. That, I was trying to say, he did get from his father. So it was a kind of substitute for the poetry he complains he didn't get, but he saw it as the poetical part of the education because it inspired in him the sublime inspiration that one gets from poetry. So that's what he was, I think, trying to say. And there I tried to stress that there were also the ancient Greeks, and especially Plato. Mill was spoon-fed Plato from very early on.
And that's about the most unusual childhood one can imagine, both then and now. And not a lot of kids, not a lot of adults, of course, are spoon-fed Plato. I'm really glad you touched on Plutarch because Plutarch is someone who's floating in the background in a number of these essays and in the autobiography. And with your background and your expertise, can you explain for our viewers a little bit about the impact that Plutarch's lives had on intellectuals, public discourse? At one time in the United States in the 19th century, Plutarch's Lives was the second most widely owned book in the country behind the Bible. This was a book that influenced generations of thinkers, and today is not well known at all. Can you talk a little bit about the book itself and also the impact that it had on Mill specifically?
Oh, you said it already. It's incredible, and it's very difficult to explain to people now unless they have historical education or historical interest, how important it was until so recently. Everything Rousseau says about the ancients comes from Plutarch. All the inspiration is from Plutarch. It's incredible. But every now and then you realize every thinker one goes to, they had read Plutarch. There is no way. It was like the Bible, as you say. So I can only corroborate what you say and say you cannot understand thinkers of the 18th or 19th century and probably early 20th without understanding that it was part of their nourishment. They had read the Bible. By the way, Mill, although he tells us he was never taught to be a Christian, he knew more about the Bible and about theology and about Christian thought than the average Christian. There is an amazing incident in Rome where he met Mr. Lucas, the first editor of the Catholic magazine, The Tablet, and he spent a week with him and he wrote daily reports to his wife. And it turns out that it was Mill who was explaining to Lucas the significance of the Christian monuments. And Lucas was more obsessed with the Roman ancient monuments and so on, but that's a parenthesis. So what I'm trying to say is Mill had a Christian education as well as a pagan education, but in the same way as the average person in the 19th century had to be biblically literate, they were also classically literate in a way that it is extremely painful to think how difficult it is now for people to follow that if they don't have the same kind of some alertness to the classics and to the importance of the classics until the early 20th century.
There were a lot of moral lessons that were drawn from those parallel lives, and there was a lot of moral learning that came from that. It wasn't just the historical piece, as you said, and it does inform a lot of that. And I actually wanted to turn a little bit to some of the some of the examples that he points to in his writing in the autobiography and that you point to, Ruth talks quite a bit about Turgot, is it Turgot? Forgive me, my French is awful. But you talk about Carrel, which is interesting. And you said that he had, and this is a quote, an extravagant admiration for Carrel, but his comments on the importance of telling the story of the lives of inspiring people are of more general applicability. So in your view, Mill, one of the goals in Mill's autobiography is to try to inspire. Is that a fair statement?
Oh, yes, yes.
Now, one of the interesting things, and our viewers may not know this about you, but you're the author of a really interesting book called Liberty Abroad, J.S. Mill on International Relations. And in that book, you take a look at a number of things that Mill addresses in terms of the challenges that Britain was facing during that period internationally. And in one of the chapters you talk about his writing on the slavery, the American Civil War, and how that was extremely influential. Did Mill, I mean, obviously Mill's a philosopher of the first order. He's an incredibly powerful thinker and an incredibly influential one. But was Mill occasionally writing aspirationally in your view? Was perhaps that Civil War writing an example of that aspirational thinking?
Oh, yes, absolutely, absolutely. He was a very engaged public moralist, as Stefan Collini called them in Victorian Britain, what we would call intellectual. Very engaged. Obviously, as is well known, he became even a member of parliament to promote his ideas. But he was, again, it's terribly interesting how it happened when he became a member of parliament. I'm not deviating this time, I think. It's related to what you said, because he's accepting to become an MP. It was just in order to get a bigger platform for his ideas, in the same way as he was using journalism and occasional writing and for his campaigning. So if I may mention a couple of examples that speak louder than any analysis, I found during writing the latest book that you mentioned, I found time and again people writing to Mill, congratulating him for raising an issue at a motion in a debate in Parliament. And Mill replying, on 2 or 3 occasions, Mill replying, no, you don't understand, I don't agree with the motion. But respecting the people who wanted it to raise it, it being the last day when it was possible to raise it, I wanted them to have a hearing. I wanted the debate to happen. And in one of these occasions, he also said, if you have read my book on liberty, you will know what I mean. Mill, believing so strongly in the importance of freedom of speech and debate, he would raise in Parliament issues which he didn't himself agree with in order to have the proper debate and have a discussion about them. And the other example and incident related to this, even more to your question, I think, is what he replied to the committee of liberals at Westminster who asked him to become their candidate in 1865. Notoriously, he sent them a number of letters saying, I'm not the right person, go to my friend Chadwick, who is very keen to become MP. You know, I'm in France for 6 years, for 6 months every year to be near my wife's grave. They insisted, they said, we want you. So he sent them a list of conditions, which included, I will not do any canvassing and any campaigning. I will not do any constituency work. I will not give any pledges. If I'm elected on the general principles, which I will, of course, explain to my constituents, but not giving any pledges how I will vote on particular occasions. If I'm elected, I will use it as a platform for my ideas, and especially the most unpopular ones, which have no other way of being aired in an assembly like the House of Commons. And notoriously, the thing that cost him most and cost him his re-election, in my opinion, was his campaigning for women's rights and equality, and the fact that he proposed in 1866 for the reform bill that became the Reform Bill of 1867 to substitute person for man, which would have given the right to vote to women on the same basis, of course. So that, I hope, is very much related to the question. He wanted to inspire, and he wanted to generate debate and reach the debate and reach the conversation. At the time when debates in the House of Commons were fully reported in the Times and other newspapers, of course.
He sounds like the kind of candidate we could use today, somebody who would make fewer...
Yes, in America, you have C-SPAN, but I don't know how many people watch it.
I don't think anybody watches it anymore, unfortunately, which is it's a rather unfortunate situation. Well, that's interesting. So in that sense, in your view, his view on gender as well as slavery was also a form of aspirational public writing where he is trying to change the discourse and trying to move in a particular direction.
Absolutely, absolutely. In the American Civil War campaign, he was crucial in reinforcing the very tiny minority of the elites who were in favor of the North. The vast majority of the British elites were for the South for a number of reasons: self-determination, they are free traders as opposed to the North, which was not, and so many other issues. Whereas Mill from the beginning thought, but this is about slavery. Don't be deluded. And he became, I have written an article called Negrophilist Crusader, because that's what he was called by his friends. And he was seen as almost deranged in his zeal for the North and for the victory of the North, because he was so opposed to slavery. And he could see the stakes from very early on and try to explain them to the British public. So he was absolutely crucial as a campaigner there, and in many other occasions on foreign policy issues.
It's interesting how in the UK, because we tend to think about that since the UK or since Britain had abolished slavery in England in 1820, is it 1820?
The 30s, early 30s.
The 30s, yes. That we tend to think that issue was settled, but in terms of the American Civil War and the cotton industry, of course, and the textile industries, it was very much alive and real for that.
It was not that people were in favor of slavery, but they didn't see the Civil War as being about slavery. And Mill insisted it is about slavery. Let me explain to you why. And he wrote two extremely powerful articles in 1862. But also he did an awful lot of campaigning with politicians, sending them pamphlets, trying to, there was a time when Britain and the US could go to war, Britain and the North could go to war, and Mill mediated, and then there was the Alabama case to settle because the British were equipping ships for the South, breaking international law, and in all that he played a very crucial role.
So it's interesting. No, continue, please.
No.
Okay. So we've only got a couple minutes left, and I was going to turn us back to life writing, which is, of course, the issue that Ruth raises and we discussed in her interview, that whole concept of life writing. What, in terms of the autobiography itself, and I think this is helpful for our viewers right here, and also the folks who are reading the forum and perhaps hearing about the autobiography the first time, or perhaps familiar with it. What is your view on Mill's goals in the autobiography? How should the reader, in your view, approach it when thinking about Mill, whether they're familiar with him, extremely familiar with him, or not? What was his idea behind writing this autobiography, and how can readers think about how they might approach it?
Wonderful. Yes. I'll, again, one example before I answer. Matthew Arnold was the famous apostle of culture against the Philistines, in favor of the harmonious cultivation of the individual in all their richness and variety and so on. And once Mill complained in a letter about something that was terribly unfair, and he said, this is like Matthew Arnold calling me an enemy of culture, because Matthew Arnold had so misunderstood Mill during his life that he thought he was one of the Philistines, a utilitarian Benthamite who doesn't care about culture, which is so grossly unfair that I fully understand Mill's complaint in that letter. When Mill died and Matthew Arnold read the autobiography, he wrote a letter to somebody saying how wrongly I had got him, how I completely misunderstood him. So that is a tribute to Mill's autobiography. It was an explanation of what he was about and what motivated him and what was important for him. I think that example is a very succinct answer to your question.
So that's a personal statement in your view, then. It's a personal statement about the work itself.
It's about yes, what was important for him, but he was hoping to inspire people, definitely, as we were saying earlier. So he was hoping to say, you can change your circumstances, you can fight against what was given to you and shape it to a great extent. And this is what I tried to do, and this is how I tried to do it. Incidentally, independently of his intentions, the reason why I have read it many times, and as I wrote in my second response, I found myself astonished at how many things I noticed for the first time this time, having read it dozens of times before, but that's the richness of the text, of course, and the wonderful thing about teaching and rereading things every year is also how it depicts a whole world, the whole Victorian culture, the inspiration of the classics and lives and Plutarch and the admiration both people in antiquity and people in the rest of the world and so on. So because he says it's an uneventful life, and he's extremely modest about it, as Jeremy notes in his essay. But if you ignore what he says and go on reading it, it's an extremely pleasant text and extremely informative about Victorian life and Victorian culture, besides the issue about character and building your own character that he wanted to convey first and foremost. Obviously, there's also the moving story with his wife that has been discussed in some of the essays.
Yeah, and that whole question about Harriet and that relationship as well that we get into a little bit with David Conway in his interview. So I want to end with this, and I asked Jeremy this, and I'll ask you this, and Ruth and everyone. If you are new to Mill, and if one of our viewers is curious as to how they might begin with Mill, where do you begin with Mill? Do you begin with On Liberty? Do you begin with the essays? Where do you personally start if you're a new Mill fan or aspiring Mill fan?
Oh, that's a brilliant question. And I haven't thought about it, but if I had to answer immediately, which I do, I'll be unorthodox. I love On Liberty, and again, I've read it dozens of times. I love the autobiography, and I've read it dozens of times. I would begin with one of the essays. One option would be Nature. His essay on nature, one of the 3 essays on religion that were published posthumously. One should read them carefully because he had not prepared them for publication, and Mill changed his mind a lot about things. He was open-minded. But Nature he had prepared. It was the first of the 3, and his stepdaughter said he was about to publish it. So it is his opinions before he died. It's such a devastating philosophical argument about fallacies, fallacious justifications of various institutions and ideas on the argument that they are natural, and such a reversal of them that I would recommend that to people, especially the philosophically inclined. It's one of the most powerful statements of ideas about nature and how it should affect our judgments normatively. Other people who are not particularly inclined on philosophical argument may find essays such as Civilization, which he published in 1836, very interesting. It would give them a picture of an extremely rich mind in his youth, in this case. So there are some shorter essays that could be a good introduction besides the obvious On Liberty and Consideration, the autobiography.
Georgios, thank you very much for taking the time out to talk to us, and thank you very much for an excellent essay and an excellent response, and thank you for your thoughts on Mill and autobiography and life writing.
Thank you very much. It's been a wonderful conversation.
And one that we hope continues. Thank you. Take care.